This is probably going to be a very long video, so let's not waste time and get straight to business. I enjoyed Black Flag Resynced. There are some criticisms I have, and certainly some things I prefer about the original game, but Resynced retains the general formula of Black Flag, and Black Flag is just a fun video game. It has an enjoyable gameplay loop, satisfying progression systems, engaging side quests and activities, a lively, vibrant open world, unforgettable soundtrack, and a great story to tie it all together. One of the best in the franchise. In fact, I've always felt the story is the biggest strength of Black Flag as a whole. Edward has one of the most personal and impactful journeys of Assassin's Creed. The voice acting cast is incredible. I believe Black Flag and Origins boast the two best casts in the series, and resyncing with this story in 2026 kinda makes you realize how terrible most modern Assassin's Creed stories are by comparison. I don't think Resynced is one of those remakes that replaces the original game by any means. The original is still well worth playing in my opinion. I know I'll still be returning to it in the future, and thankfully it's not being removed from stores like Ubisoft did for the original Assassin's Creed 3. And while there is a lot that's kept the same in Resynced as the original Black Flag, in equal measure there are changes and additions large and small littered throughout this game, be it to the mission design, story structure, dialogue, or gameplay systems. Gameplay-wise especially, they're quite different feeling games. And let's just start with what I probably missed most about the original while I was playing Resynced, and that's just the general game feel and controls. Now I admit, I haven't played every remake in existence, but I don't think it's too common for the remake to have less responsive controls than its original counterpart. Generally, you'd think that's something that would only improve and get better over time, but this is Assassin's Creed, baby, we go backwards here. The movement and controls in the original Black Flag feel a lot more snappy and responsive. There was a tighter turning radius and you can make more precise, incremental movements. Resynced, like the last few games, has a kind of floaty feel to it. That's probably the best way I can describe it. You don't have as much fine-tuned control over Edward. There are a couple main contributors to this feeling. One is the movement animations. These last few games have been built on the foundation of the changes made to Valhalla's movement system. There was a very conscious effort in that game to bring a certain weight and physical momentum to Eivor's base movement. So they implemented a new animation system where instead of being able to instantly snap into the direction you want to go, the momentum of the current animation has to finish before catching up to your input, which creates this kind of delayed feeling. It almost feels like a slight input delay. And while Edward certainly doesn't feel as slow and heavy to control as Eivor, these last few games have still been built on the back of these movement animations, where this general floaty, delayed feeling persists. I mean, go back to even Origins and Odyssey, and you can immediately feel how quickly and sharply the player character reacts to your inputs by comparison. And in such a movement and parkour-focused series like Assassin's Creed, responsiveness and precise control is very important. Not to mention, you're missing some of the more detailed movement animations, like when running through water, that created this realistic feel of weight and resistance. The other contributing factor to this is the control scheme and the lack of a high and low profile based movement system. In every Assassin's Creed game predating Origins, including OG Black Flag, the default low profile movement was a walk. In the classic games, you'd hold the high-profile input to jog, then legs to sprint. Starting with AC3, they streamlined it to simply holding high-profile to sprint and auto-parkour, and on controller, by easing up on the right trigger, you could bring that speed down to a brisk jog. Here in Resynced, like it's been for a while now, default movement is a jog, requiring you to gently press the analog stick forward if you wish to walk. On a keyboard, that's obviously not an option, so you have to use the walk toggle, which kinda sucks because you have no control over how fast that walk is, and it's without fail always really slow. And then there's a sprint toggle, which by default on the controller is left stick click. When engaging in parkour, it's far more beneficial to have the definitive tactile feedback of holding an input to know for sure you're sprinting. I was holding on to some type of hope that Ubisoft Singapore would be able to implement a legacy control scheme of sorts as an option in the settings by launch, but unfortunately that's not the case. Like the recent games, you can customize your controls, but the fact that so many people are having to make tutorials, buy special controllers with paddles, and do settings gymnastics to get a more comfortable, effective control scheme is kinda ridiculous. The default controls are simply inadequate for a lot of people. and the controls themselves are only a symptom of a much larger issue when there's no defined high and low profile movement states. I'm really over how these recent AC games feel to control, and again, it's a little more glaring and frustrating to me in Resynced, just because we have the original game from 13 years ago to directly compare it to, and it feels better to play, which shouldn't be the case. However, what I think will prove to be the most talked about and debated of the gameplay differences between the original Black Flag and Resynced is the combat. The original game, like AC3 and the classic games that preceded it, used a paired animation system. So whenever you attacked or responded to an attack, the player character and enemy AI would perform choreographed, synchronized animations. Every slash, counter, guard break, and kill had these synchronized animations to simulate the look and fluidity of a realistic fight. I felt this was pretty fitting for the old, traditional action-adventure Assassin's Creeds, where you're mostly playing as assassins who fight very efficiently, precisely, and lethally. It let you do some of the cool things you'd see these characters do in the cinematic trailers, almost like you were playing in a movie. Other game series like Batman Arkham, Insomniac Spider-Man, the Middle-earth games, or even Sleeping Dogs and Mad Max utilize similar paired animation systems. It's what enables the combat in those games to look so fluid and cinematic. But that's not to say it didn't have its issues in Assassin's Creed, the most common of which people point out is its simplicity and lack of difficulty. Assassin's Creed has always been relatively easy. I think this is a result of being such a mainstream franchise with a wide experience and skill range of players, and in those old games there were no difficulty options, so they needed to balance the game with the more casual player in mind. And with Black Flag specifically, while it looked really cool and flashy and the animations are incredible, it wasn't the most engaging or mentally stimulating combat system in the world. I mean, I've always thought that Black Flag's combat was a slightly watered down version of AC3's to begin with. AC3 had more weapons, kill animations, and enemy variety, like the Jaegers, who made AC3's combat a bit more challenging. That being said, I still like Black Flag's combat, and felt it came to be more about trying to kill enemies in the coolest, most unique ways possible, with its vast catalog of special moves and animations, rather than only ever hitting counter kills and endlessly chaining takedowns. Black Flag Resynced uses the hitbox system that's been present in Assassin's Creed since Origins. However, it's quite different from the RPG games' version of it because it's not really about endlessly wailing on spongy enemies. I mean, for one, enemies aren't that damage spongy to begin with, especially when you get some of the higher damage weapons, and two, it's more so centered around takedowns. Not too unlike the original game in that aspect. This combat system is all about finding the most efficient and effective ways to deplete an enemy's defense meter, be it with combos or defensive moves like perfect parries to initiate takedowns, and in the case of a parry, chaining those takedowns. The three main offensive combos you'll utilize to do so are a rope dart immediately followed up with a leg sweep, kicking enemies into objects in the environment to stun them for a wall takedown, and against the tougher enemy types like brutes, captains, and demolitionists, a quick shot with the pistol is enough to break their defense. Unlike the others though, those tougher enemies can't be the victim of a chain takedown without first having their defense broken, so you're incentivized to quick shot them before attempting to extend the chain. Unless you use the shark teeth trinket that lets you chain brutes without having to break their defense first. The chain takedowns also have a pretty generous extension window. You have quite a while to extend the chain to enemies who aren't in your direct vicinity. Although, because you can only chain takedowns after a parry, and the parry timing is pretty easy to get down, I do feel it incentivizes you to have a more passive, reactionary playstyle. Meanwhile, doing those combos for takedowns doesn't reward you with a chain. It kind of feels like you're being rewarded more kills for doing less work within the combat system. Of course, one of the core combat mechanics the hitbox system introduced was the ability to freely dodge whenever. When you perfectly time a dodge in Resynced, you'll get a brief slow-mo and can deal a powerful counterattack. Most times it's better to parry since it rewards you with an immediate takedown, but on enemies who use mostly unblockable attacks like brutes, dodging is often your only defensive option. By dodging into enemies, you can flip over them, but it doesn't work against the aforementioned tougher enemies if you haven't broken their defense first. You can use enemies as human shields against gunfire like the original. This might sound sadistic, but I like that Edward now slashes them across the neck after they're shot to confirm the kill. And if there are no nearby enemies to use as a shield, you can still dodge, which is nice, because in the original, if you didn't have anyone to use as a shield, you were kinda hung out to dry, and just had to do your best to serpentine and make the gunners miss, get into cover, or shoot them before they could shoot you. All the original enemy types return as well, plus the new enemy, the Demolitionist. He can be dealt with in a similar way to the brutes and captains, with a quick pistol shot to break his defense, but the obvious main difference being he uses a blunderbuss, Adewale style, which can do some serious damage from close range. There's no using a human shield against it, and because it has such a wide spread, it can be difficult to dodge. Like the OG, the brutes can't be parried, they throw grenades and only attack with unblockables that have to be dodged, or a special body slam move that you have to counter by kicking them. You can't kick, leg sweep, or dodge over them while their defense meters are intact either. So the pistol and perfect dodges are typically your best options against them. Agile guards, well, it's in the name, they have quicker attacks and can still chase you down and tackle you if you try to run away. Captains use quicker combos of parryables and unblockables, and gunners have very fragile defense meters. You can rope dart them for an instant takedown every time. You have to get close enough to them first though, and they're usually distantly positioned to snipe you. The enemy AI can also adapt to a certain extent. You can't use the kick twice in a row without some type of other move mixed in between, otherwise they'll instantly counter you, shutting it down. If you keep spamming the rope dart, they'll start blocking it, even if you're using it on a separate enemy each time, and leg sweeps won't work outright on most enemies if you're attempting it head on. It only works when hitting them from a blind spot, after a perfect dodge or light attack combo, when their defense is broken, or after a rope dart pull. Additionally, all the takedowns are animations from the original game, be it with the dual swords, hidden blades, environment, or the unarmed combat. Even the double counter takedowns are back, which you can trigger by parrying two enemies in quick succession. Though Resynced is missing a lot of the original double counter animations, including all of the hidden blade ones, and of course the unarmed, single sword, musket, and axe ones too. Each weapon type had multiple double counter animations. They were so clean too. Once you get acclimated and gain a good understanding of what combos work best against what enemy types, you can get into a satisfying rhythm and flow with this combat system, where you're not even really thinking anymore about what you have to do, you're just doing it. It's capable of looking cinematic in the right hands. So to say this is just the same combat from the RPGs, like I've seen some people say, is very inaccurate to me. Yes, it uses the hitbox framework, but its emphasis is on breaking enemies' defense and takedowns, with many of the mechanics and animations from the original Black Flag mixed in. It truly feels more like a hybrid between the counter-based combat of old and hitbox of new. That being said, it's not without its issues. One that I think was very predictable, and many could have guessed before even playing the game, is the lack of weapon variety. Not being able to use hidden blades or disarm and pick up single swords, muskets, or axes like the original game is a huge bummer, and I'm sure will be a lot of people's biggest hang-up when it comes to Resynced as a whole. And again, I already thought the original game was kinda lacking in weapons compared to AC3. Unarmed combat is in the game and actually feels quite good with the original takedown animations, but unlike the original, you can't use it whenever you want. It's only usable in designated missions and taverns. You also can't, with one exception, trigger those rope dart and pistol double kills and finishers. I say one exception because there is a pistol finisher in the game, where if you quickshot an enemy with the pistol from close range right after breaking their defense, Edward will barrel stuff them with this unique animation. I discovered it completely by accident, and it doesn't happen too often unless you intentionally go out of your way to do it, but it's there and it does look cool. Ultimately though, the game is still missing a huge chunk of the original game's combat animation variety. It doesn't take long before you've seen just about every way to kill an enemy the combat has to offer, and it starts to feel repetitive, using the same combos and strategies with the same animations over the course of, depending on how much you do, up to a 50-hour game. I do appreciate that there's tangible gameplay differences between the dual sword types now, with the cutlasses, pistol swords, and rapiers. Each has a unique heavy attack, but I don't think it injects nearly enough variety to keep things fresh and interesting over the course of a whole playthrough. And you ultimately feel more incentivized to go with whichever has the best damage output, or allows for the most chain takedowns anyway. Altair and Ezio's swords are available in the Animus exchange. I love the design of Altair's swords, and it has the highest maximum chain takedown you can have in the game at 4, but its perk heals you after every takedown, which has, in my opinion, this awful looking glowing effect every time it activates. I hope they remove that or give an option to turn it off. It remains even when you turn off the combat effects in the HUD settings. That alone discouraged me from using it pretty quickly, but thankfully I could at least keep the look of the weapon since there's still a transmog system. They did tone down the general combat VFX though, as they said they would, whereas in older versions of the game pre-launch, the parry effect was a visually loud orange explosion. Now it's a much subtler blue effect, and there's an option to even turn that off in the HUD settings, which I did pretty early on. The same can be done for health bars, and combat works perfectly fine without them. You can't see the enemy's defense meter with it off, but you get a feel for what breaks that meter, and there's enough diegetic cues like enemies losing their hats, wigs, or with the audio feedback that it's very apparent when you've broken their defense. I mean, you'll also just see the takedown prompt show up if you still have that on. You're not going to break someone's defense and not know about it. However, there's an I'd say significant caveat to this. Turning off health bars means you can't tag enemies in stealth for some reason. I don't know why those two things are linked, it was the same way in Shadows. You should be able to toggle those things separately in the HUD settings. I'm also still not crazy about how dramatic and over the top some of the combat sound effects are, especially when parrying or chaining takedowns. I get they wanted to add some audio feedback and give this feeling of impact with these sounds, but I think they can be a bit much. It just feels a little too arcadey and immersion breaking to me. I feel the same way about the assassination sound effects. Why does every single assassination need to have such a dramatic sound? I get having it for special occasions like air or double assassinations, but having it on everything is kind of obnoxious to me. AC1 did this too, and while I love the original Hidden Blade sound effect, I much preferred how AC2 pivoted to only having it play for high-profile assassinations. I guess while we're on the topic of sound effects, the pistols don't sound nearly as satisfying to me either. The sound effect is a lot thinner, the original had more bass and punch to it.
Has a good kick, yes?
Boom in battle, his ability to swim.
Resynced's combat certainly isn't flawless. Again, I think people's biggest issue with it will be the lack of weapons and animations, but they did make lots of changes to have the hitbox system better fit the speed and lethality you'd come to expect from the action-adventure Assassin's Creeds. To be honest though, deep down, I'd really like to see Assassin's Creed give paired animation combat another shot in the near future. I think it best suited the cinematic, stylized approach of the action-adventure Assassin's Creed games. Just bring some more substance and challenge to it. Other games have shown it can be done. I mean, AC Unity's combat may be super janky at times, but it did make some strides towards providing more challenge within a paired animation system. There are ways to make it far better than it was, and I hope future games at least consider it. But that's enough about combat, let's move on to parkour. Resynced is easily the best of the parkour system we've had since Origins, low as a bar as that may be. Edward's parkour animations are twitchy and fast. I still think he lacks the general polish and fluidity of original Edward. The way he moves sometimes still doesn't look all that natural, but it's certainly better than the last few games. The manual jump feels fantastic, it's responsive, looks smooth, and carries a good sense of momentum. It feels far better than it did in Mirage and Shadows. I imagine the game having more time to be developed with it in mind instead of being tacked on post-launch certainly helps with that. It's so versatile and really opens up a multitude of possibilities, whether it's skipping a wall run, jumping straight up to an overhanging ledge, giving you the freedom to jump before a ledge whenever you want, etc. Manual jump, now that I've got you back, I will never take you for granted again. It was a dark 11 years without you, my friend. For the first time in the RPG system, we have height gaining side and back ejects at launch. Mirage and Shadows had to add that in post-launch updates. You can also now perform wall run cancels, something you could do in the classic and Kenway parkour systems but was not previously possible in this current one. Just side or back eject really early in the wall running animation and it will cancel the wall run to perform the eject. There's not a ton of breathing room to pull it off like the classic system though, it's a very tight window. Edward's wall running animation is crazy fast. The advanced parkour setting enables freeform side and back ejects. There's not many situations where it's very practical to use though. The context of where it's actually triggerable within the city's architecture is very limited. A lot of the time when you may be attempting it, you'll just end up doing a normal safe eject. It's completely dependent on your environment. So unless you're using it from extreme heights, it's not consistently usable and reliable like the classic games. Same with Catch Ledge, as it's primarily meant to be used in tandem with those free side and back ejects, as you can use it to reach and pluck yourself out of the void you jumped into. You can use it with manual jump too, if you overshoot a ledge or something like that, but again, its practicality is quite limited. You can't use it during contextual ejects. Something you're going to use far more often is the parkour down quick descent mechanic from Shadows. Edward has Yasuke's quick descent animation, which I actually prefer to Naoi's anyway since there's no flips attached to it. It just feels smoother and quicker, which is ironic given Yasuke was so much slower at parkour in general, and you can still do the little fancy backwards quick descent as well, and again, Edward uses Yasuke's animation, not Naoi's. Those acrobatic ninja flips would not fit Edward's profile anyway. Beyond mechanics though, what helps elevate Resynced's parkour a few steps above the RPGs is its city design. Havana in particular has always been an enjoyable city to parkour in for me. There's plenty of parkour starters, verticality, and fleshed out pathing from rooftops to trees bridging the gaps between buildings. There's no longer the automatic animation of running through building interiors with a dynamic camera from the Kenway games and cities, but you can still go through those interiors manually. They still exist as part of the city layouts. Those animations were pure spectacle, you didn't have to do anything, but really cinematic spectacle nonetheless that I did find myself missing. It's nice to have tree parkour back though. As much as AC3 kinda gutted the parkour of the classic system back in 2012, tree parkour was an addition I think everyone enjoyed. It allowed for seamless navigation through forests and jungles, and like I mentioned, sometimes they used the trees in cities to connect building rooftops to one another. I really liked having it back in Resynced and hope it's something that can make its way into new future titles as well. Hexa already seems like a game that would have a lot of dense forests based on its reveal trailer alone. Credit where credit is due, they've managed to make this parkour system more than serviceable through numerous changes in the last couple games, and it's now the best it's been in Resynced. Even with all that being said though, it still feels like this system has a very capped ceiling. It's still far from the ideal, and after nearly 10 years and 6 games with it, longer than any other parkour system has lasted in this series by the way, which is actually insane to me, I'm more than ready for something new. Something built from scratch that can actually bring us closer to the heights of what parkour used to be. Because make no mistake, this system will not cut it for AC1 or Ezio game remakes. It can work for Black Flag without ruffling very many feathers, since AC4 was by no means the pinnacle of parkour in the franchise to begin with, but use it for any of those older games and good enough simply won't be anymore. I'm really hoping Hexa is what they say it is, and that Resynced is the final chapter in this long, arduous parkour era. Assassin's Creed Shadows initially neglected parkour, but made a big effort to bring improvements post-launch. That's because the gameplay pillar that had the majority of Ubisoft Quebec's attention during development was stealth. Shadows made a lot of genuine foundational improvements to stealth for this franchise, most of which made it into Resynced, though some were omitted or simplified a bit. The light-based stealth, for instance, is here, and heavy rain will still further obscure you from enemies, but you can't fully conceal yourself in the dark like Shadows. It'll only affect how quickly enemies detect you, and there's no way to extinguish or destroy light sources to darken the area around you and create a more suitable environment for staying hidden. This makes the light meter feel, I wouldn't necessarily say gimmicky because it does still impact detection, but it's kind of just there. It's not something you're actively engaging with and paying close attention to at all times like Shadows. And as we've known since the reveal, the prone mechanic didn't make it into the game either, which is a bit of a shame. I thought it was a very natural fit in Assassin's Creed and hopefully will be back in future games. Shadows' cover system did carry over though, and while it's still certainly an improvement over what we had in Origins through Mirage with the soft cover system that never had a clear visual indicator of when the game's considered you in cover, I still find it occasionally finicky and frustrating at times to properly snap into place. I was detected a couple times in this game just desperately trying to get the game to listen to my inputs and put me into cover. I know Unity's cover system was extremely janky, I don't want that back, but I liked having a manual input to snap myself into cover so I could definitively tell the game what I was wanting to do, and don't find myself getting stuck or sitting there fiddling with the left stick trying to snap into place. Also, for some reason, the game doesn't let you quick use tools in cover, which I feel like is one of the most useful situations to quick drop a smoke bomb in. If you have someone coming towards you whilst you're in cover, like this example here, but there's another enemy who would see you cover assassinate the first guy behind them, then it's very useful to be able to quick drop a smoke so you can pull that off without being detected. I don't see the benefit in restricting the player from doing that here. I realize this is a small thing and you can still just manually throw the smoke bomb from cover, but I found it bizarre. Perhaps the biggest foundational change to stealth from the original Black Flag brought over from Shadows has to do with how enemy locations are scouted and displayed. The original game used a combination of eagle vision and a minimap to display enemy locations and positioning. Eagle vision didn't work through walls, but once you tagged someone, it would keep them highlighted through any surface for a fairly lengthy interval of time. Though that was hardly necessary in many stealth situations because the minimap told you pretty much everything you needed to know. Obviously, Resynced uses a compass instead, so tagging is done through the observe mechanic, often in tandem with eagle vision like Shadows. I know there's a sizable amount of people who liked the minimap, but because it displayed so much information and told you where every enemy was, including the direction they were facing, it encouraged you to constantly glance or stare at it during stealth encounters rather than truly focusing on the environment and your surroundings. You could basically play out whole sections of the game solely looking at the minimap. It was actually advantageous to do so, as if the real game was being played through this 2D circle. The most extreme example of this was during the ship stealth tailing sections, where it showed the exact detection cones of all the ships you needed to avoid on the minimap, which you couldn't see in the 3D space, meaning you had to rely on the minimap, resulting in those sections basically becoming a minimap minigame. Tagging in Resynced does still give you a general ping of the enemy's location, but all that information is presented on screen in front of you, not all contained in a little circle in the bottom corner. It also doesn't give you the outline of an enemy, so you'll still need to be aware and periodically use eagle vision to check on the exact direction they're facing. So I generally prefer this method. All the original stealth tools have returned for Resynced, and most of them actually have more utility than they did in the original game. Like the smoke bomb that can now be freely aimed and thrown wherever, and the rope dart, which is now, in addition to being a strong combat accessory, an extremely powerful stealth tool. It works a little bit differently in this game, but has so much versatility. Not to mention, having it for nearly the entire duration of the game, as you now get it very early on in Sequence 3, rather than Sequence 11 in the last hour or two of the main story, is a game changer. The first difference with the rope dart in Resynced many will notice is that when hanging a target from above, instead of Edward using the force of himself falling to the ground to hang the target up, he stays in his elevated position and pulls them up towards him. While I think the animation in the original game looks really cool, and I always liked slow walking after to really aura farm it, this change gives a more substantial mechanical difference and practical reason for choosing to do a rope dart hanging over a simple air assassination. Because now the rope dart kill doesn't force you back down to ground level like it did in the original game, and how it does for air assassinations. If you want to kill the target from above while staying in your elevated position, then you'll want to use the rope dart over the standard air assassination. And conversely, if you want to go to ground level, use air assassinate. The rope dart hanging kind of works more like the gargoyle takedowns in the Arkham series or Spider-Man, where they pull the target up to them with webs. Another difference, and this is a function I did find myself missing about the original rope dart, is you could hold the quickshot input on a target who had their back turned, and Edward would keep pulling them towards him until he could either choke them out against an object in the environment dynamically, or keep pulling them until they were in assassination range. You can't hold the input to continuously drag people towards you like that in Resynced, but you can use it to very quickly yank enemies towards you, which is extremely strong. Someone's about to detect you and you don't have time to close the gap and assassinate them?
Get over here!
One of the strongest utilizations of this is in a stalking zone like a bush, because you can just quickly pull an enemy into that bush with you for a concealed assassination. It's faster, safer, more effective, and not to mention a lot more fun than whistling and luring people over to stalking zones. You can also yank enemies off of extreme heights to kill them, which is particularly useful against those gunners sitting pretty in their towers. You could do this in the original game too, but in a more limited capacity since you could only quick use the rope dart. Having the ability to free aim it in Resynced gives you a lot more flexibility and freedom to throw it at a specific intended target. And you can do this on enemies not just above, but below you too. If you're in an elevated position and an enemy is just out of air assassination or hanging range, you can pull them towards you into range. You can also pull them into objects to knock them down. You can even use this thing to disable alarm bells, which allows you to bypass the lengthier sabotage animation and disable them from a safe distance, not having to expose yourself to the possibility of detection while manually sabotaging the bell. The rope dart has so many uses in this game, and unlike the original, it's an unlimited use item with a brief cooldown, so you're gonna have plenty of reason and opportunity to use it in stealth. This thing is like an extension of Edward himself. It was my best friend throughout my playthrough, and pulling and watching enemies fall to their deaths is genuinely so fun, it never gets old. Tool capacity and potency is still upgraded through the crafting menu and directly tied to hunting, with the omission of the rope darts now that they're unlimited use. Fighting animals is no longer a QTE, but actual combat. I've never really found fighting animals to be all that satisfying in the hitbox system, especially with how damage spongy they could be. It's not as egregious in this game as, say, Odyssey for example though, and is a bit more engaging than a simple QTE minigame. I really don't like the little remarks and quips they gave Edward when he skins every animal though. I find them kinda annoying and unnecessary.
It's pretty to watch. Pretty good.
Edward generally feels more chatty in this game than the original, which I'll dive a little deeper into when I get to the story changes. But I do really like that they let you purchase hides with animal bones now instead of just reals. This gives bones more use, where it was only material meant to be sold or used to craft a select few outfits before. Now, a major thing I absolutely miss about the original game, like top 3 things I miss about it, are its assassination animations. AC4 had so many unique, varied, and seamless assassinations that Resynced was simply not able to replicate. You know the Kenway games were really ahead of their time in the animation department when these new games can't even live up to them. Resynced has some of the original animations, but the ones it does have don't look or feel as smooth, and in totality are still only a pretty small fraction of the animations from the original game. Let's start with the sprinting assassination. In the original, it feels really fluid. Your momentum carries through the animation, and you can very seamlessly continue sprinting afterwards if you're holding high profile, letting you effectively run through the target. In Resynced, it brings your momentum to a complete halt. You have to wait for the animation to end in order to gain back control and start up a sprint again. It doesn't look as good, it makes you feel more like a spectator than an active participant in Edward's animations. That goes for single and double sprinting assassinations. Double assassinations, as has been a common talking point in the Assassin's Creed community in the lead up to this game's launch, like Shadows, have a harsh camera cut right before the animation plays to properly reposition Edward and the targets so they're all perfectly aligned. I get why they do it, but this looks very jarring. The old Assassin's Creed games kinda had to, on the fly, maneuver the NPCs into the proper place for the animation, but I still think that method looked a lot better. The trade-off with the camera cuts just isn't worth it in my opinion. I hope they can either remove those in Resynced post-launch or in future games going forward. The amount of actual double assassination animations in this game are also very lacking. There's only one animation for each movement state. One for walking and jogging, one for crouching, and one for sprinting. And the crouching one literally just looks like a mini version of the air assassination. I don't really like that one, and that's obviously far less variety than the original game. Even Shadows had more than that. The original even went as far as to have special animations for when you were coming at 2 targets from an angle. There were 3 of them. There was a high profile animation where Edward stabs one target, then leaps over them to stab the next, and 2 others that you triggered in low profile by pressing the high profile and assassinate inputs at the same time. None of those are in Resynced. If you try to assassinate 2 enemies from an angle, it will only assassinate the one target in front of you. And to top it all off, double assassinations can be a little inconsistent. Quite a few times the game would tell me I could initiate a double assassination just for that to switch last second as I hit the input to only assassinate a single target, resulting in the other guy who just witnessed me kill his friend detecting me. Don't get me wrong, I love having double assassinations back, especially double hidden blade ones. I championed for them to return for years on my channel. I'll still take them with these issues over not having them at all, but there was a fluidity and consistency to them in the older games that is certainly absent in this latest iteration of them. Interestingly enough, as I mentioned in my previous video, this game actually has a lot of Unity's assassinations, which I know gets people excited. Any slight connection a new game has to Unity has people jumping for joy. It has several of Unity's low and high profile animations and even its cover assassinations. Believe it or not, they actually incorporated more Unity assassinations than from the original Black Flag. which I don't particularly mind, but I loved the basic low-profile assassination from the Kenway games. It's my favorite base low-profile animation in the franchise. Not because it's the flashiest in the world, but because it's so quick, smooth, and subtle. When I think of assassins, I think of smooth killers. They assassinate so quickly and subtly that people don't even realize what's happened until the person's body has hit the floor, and by that point, the assassin is long gone. This low-profile animation best reflects that to me, and I love how quickly it allows you to keep moving and going from one target to the next. Oh, and that kind of crunchy hidden blade sound effect was really satisfying too. I'm disappointed that animation didn't make it into the game, though if it's anything like the sprinting one, it probably wouldn't have been nearly as smooth either. My least favorite animations in the pool are the ones that are still being used from Valhalla, like this hidden blade swipe that's used on crouching or sitting enemies. I've never liked how it looks. It's like a shallow slash that doesn't look like it would actually kill someone, and it looks even dumber when you don't have the hidden blade and you're just doing a swipe punch that immediately knocks people out. While on the topic of non-lethality, because you can't equip your fists as a weapon in this game like the original, there's no way to intentionally knock people out instead of assassinating them. Like unarmed combat, there are sections of the game where it requires you to use non-lethal force, but you have no control over when that is. The only consistent way to be non-lethal is to use sleeping darts. Might not be a big deal to a lot of people, but I know some who like having that freedom, using non-lethal playstyles, and only assassinating their targets. As I mentioned in a previous video, you can't do dual sword assassinations either, or any of the other assassinations with the weapons you could pick up, of course. Granted, many of the dual sword assassinations in the original were just the same ones used for the hidden blades, but they still looked cool and felt distinct to Edward as a dual-wielding pirate. It brought some more visual flair and personality to his animations. I'm sad to not see them here. And I'll keep bringing up this very specific feature until one of these AC games finally brings it back, but I miss being able to manually flick and hold out the hidden blades whenever. It felt satisfying to do, and there was some practical use to it too, as by doing so you would ensure Edward would assassinate the target at the earliest possible moment. It was a way of preloading the assassination. I know I'm not alone in missing this, but it was such a small niche thing you could do, so I want to bring some more attention to it. Anyways, that finally brings me to my darling social stealth. Oh, this one pains me. I wish I had positive things to say, but I really don't. Social stealth is back, it's here, it exists, though I'm sorry to say that it's not very useful, and even less so than it was in the original game, which, as a self-proclaimed social stealth enthusiast, slightly crushes my soul. I guess it's still better than not having it at all, though. You can hire dancers like the original, but they're usually positioned far away from areas where they could realistically help, and it's so easy to lose them once you've hired them. The game forces you into a walking speed, which, if you're planning to bring them a fairly significant distance away from where you hired them, that walk is very slow, so you're going to want to sprint with them to get there quicker. Except your sprint is way faster than they're capable of moving, and if you get just a bit too far ahead of them, seriously, not that far at all, you'll lose them, they'll abandon you. This would happen in the old games if you got really far, but certainly not to this extent. The walk is too slow, the sprint is too fast. Ironically enough, this would be the ideal situation to jog, but the game doesn't let you jog when you've hired dancers. You can only walk or sprint. You'll also lose them once you've entered a restricted area. One of the most effective ways to utilize dancers in the original game was by infiltrating restricted areas with them. To be fair, I think I probably used them the most during tailing missions in the original, which there are far less of here, and you can still send them to distract targeted guards dynamically, so in very limited contexts they can be useful if you want to, say, slip by a guard into a restricted area unnoticed, but I was pretty disappointed by the extent of their utility overall. Oh, and they also don't assist in combat anymore either. They used to actually try to help by holding back enemies so you could kill them. Now they just run away. Cowards. The drunkards are a little more useful. You can send them in to fight enemies and use that as a diversion. It helps that they run a little faster than the dancers and don't force you to walk either, so they're not as easy to lose. You need 3 NPCs to crowd blend with now instead of 2, which I find an unnecessary change. By doing that, you're just limiting the context of where it's usable even more. The blend fade time is also significantly shorter. You used to get a small grace period of about a few seconds after exiting a crowd where you'd still be considered hidden, which was ideal for moving from crowd to crowd without breaking a blend or temporarily exiting one to assassinate a passing guard. That's not as doable with the blend fade time being much shorter, and crowd blending, like the other recent games that have implemented it, doesn't feel very smooth to do in general because the default movement is a jog, and you obviously need to bring that down to a walk in order to crowd blend, which might have you slamming into NPCs you're attempting to blend with. On mouse and keyboard, you have to use the walk toggle, which again is very slow. There's just not many situations in this game where crowd blending is a viable strategy. Part of that is simply how Black Flag is designed. Social stealth is generally a lot more contextual in the Kenway games than it was in the classics, but I still found myself using it more in the cities in the original game than I did here. The coin throwing mechanic has made its grand return for the first time since Unity, but I don't think many people used that in the original game to begin with. The purpose behind it is by throwing coins, you can draw a crowd to lure and divert guards' attention, or create a crowd blending opportunity with all the NPCs flocking over the coins. But you can't even blend with the NPCs picking up coins in Resynced, so it's really only about drawing guards' attention. It's another very situational mechanic, just like benches. Was I expecting Resynced to be the game that brings social stealth to its highest potential and glory in Assassin's Creed? No, of course not, but I was hoping it would at least be as viable as it was in the original, which it unfortunately isn't. I really hope we get an Assassin's Creed game in the near future that embraces and makes social stealth a true pillar of its gameplay. It looks cool, it's important from a ludonarrative standpoint as the second tenet of the Creed, and has so much potential to be expanded upon. Look at 007 First Light that just came out with new social stealth mechanics like Bluff. Something like that would fit Assassin's Creed perfectly. I want to see some genuine effort being made to expand on its mechanics and utility. It really has not evolved much at all from AC2. I think social stealth is one of the things that helps make Assassin's Creed unique in the grand scope of all the other stealth-based franchises out there. A huge part of what makes Black Flag unique within the scope of the Assassin's Creed franchise is its commitment to naval warfare as a fulfillment of the pirate fantasy. Only a select few games in the series have elected to include naval combat and traversal, yet none embrace or make it as integral to its experience as Black Flag. Odyssey is probably the closest in that regard, but even then it doesn't feel as core to the game's identity as it does here. Ironically enough, I actually remember naval combat being one of my least favorite parts about Black Flag way back when I first played it, because I was always wanting to get back to the on-the-ground assassin gameplay. That's what I played Assassin's Creed for. The naval sections in AC3 were probably my least favorite parts of that game for the same reason. I just didn't like being forcefully removed from the ground to progress in the story, so to discover almost the entirety of Black Flag was based around it had me initially very apprehensive back in the day. I obviously came around to it, and now in Resynced it's the most straightforwardly improved gameplay pillar of the original game, since it plays and controls basically exactly the same, only with added depth, difficulty if you want it, and some smart design changes. Every weapon on the Jackdaw now has a secondary fire mode. In the case of the broadsides, you now have 3, since you already had heavy shot in the original. I didn't find myself using heavy shot as much here though, because the new heated shot fulfills a very similar role. As that high damage, close range option, only unlike the heavy shot, it can be aimed. The bow now has a new secondary fire mode called double shot, which I did find myself using a lot of. Chain shot is more intended to stun and temporarily immobilize ships rather than providing significant range and firepower, making it a good pairing with the double shot because it does provide those things. It has very good range and fires a powerful barrage intended to inflict hull damage. These two make for a pretty deadly 1-2 punch at the front of the ship. The shrapnel barrels now accompany the fire barrels at the stern. They're better for dropping against ships attempting to ram you. I actually found them very useful against the legendary ships, since they're fast and try to chase or ram you a lot. Deadman's Cohort serves a different purpose than the standard mortar because it allows you to effectively paint a line of where you want it to fire so you can aim at multiple ships at once. It doesn't deal as much pure damage as the standard mortar, making that better for fighting individual ships, but Deadman's Cohort is great when you may have a bunch of smaller enemy ships scattered about. You can target and deal damage to each of them simultaneously. My only real issue with it is you get it so late into the game. It's useful, but it would have been nice to have a lot sooner. It almost feels like what they did with the rope dart in the original game, where they give you this powerful tool, but then not much time or opportunity left in the game to properly use it. It's connected to the officer Deadman Smith, whose missions don't become available until far later in the game compared to the other two officers. All the officer abilities in general are very strong though. Lucy gives you perfect brace, which basically feels like a ship parry. By timing the brace input just before you're hit by enemy cannons, mortars, barrels, or rams, you can significantly reduce the damage you take. It may not be the flashiest of the new abilities, but it's a lifesaver and by far the one you'll use the most, especially if you play on the new hard difficulty. The Padre gives you Ram Dash, which has a cooldown but some serious range and speed. Not to mention dealing lots of damage when it actually connects. It's not only useful for one-shotting or near one-shotting a lot of ships, but also as an evasive move to quickly get out of a sticky situation since it accelerates so quickly and grants you such a massive speed boost. It too is very good against legendary ships. There was a ramming mechanic like this in original Black Flag, not as strong, but it didn't have as long of a cooldown either. You were awarded it for defeating all the legendary ships, which again was kind of dumb because it would have been useful to have throughout the game, especially against those legendary ships. Rogue actually rectified this, you get it from the very beginning in Rogue. Deadman Smith, in addition to giving you that new mortar, has an ability that lets you fire an additional volley from your cannons, effectively doubling your damage. Once you've depleted a ship's health bar, you can still of course board them, but instead of having very specific objectives to complete a board, you now have to deplete a morale meter, which you do by killing enemies or completing some of those objectives from the original game, like destroying powder caches or cutting down flags. I really like this change. It gives you more freedom in how you choose to complete a board, although it's not as easy to complete solely using the swivel gun. It can be done, but not as frequently and easily in my experience. When boarding is complete, you'll have similar options like repairing the jackdaw or lowering your wanted level. The bribing and naval notoriety system works the exact same as the original game, and there's a new option on some ships to loot the captain's lockbox for additional loot, or you can still choose to send the ship to Kenway's fleet. Kenway's fleet has been completely overhauled and resynced. I always thought this is one of those things that would be omitted or overlooked if they ever remade Black Flag, because it was very much of its time. It had the old companion app you could use and everything. Don't get me wrong, I always really liked it, but was worried it might be too niche or considered outdated to be brought into a remake, but I'm really glad they didn't forget about it. They actually reworked and for the most part improved it. It's still accessible in the Jackdaw's Quarters and Great Inagua. In fact, when you use it in Great Inagua, you'll actually get a little cutscene of the ships you assigned sailing out of port, and I like that it all takes place in-game on a little physical map now. Every ship type in Resynced's version of Kenway's fleet has a purpose and specific missions only they can do. Trade requires schooners, piracy brigs, scouting frigates, and patrols require man-o'-wars. This gives you reason to recruit different types of ships to Kenway's fleet, rather than stacking up on all the strongest frigates and man-o'-wars by the end game like I always did in the original. Gemstones are gone, that's how you would purchase more docks and repair ships in the original version. Now you just unlock dock space through upgrading the manor at Great Inagua and repairing ships through reals and raw materials. I like that they tied more benefits to upgrading the manor. You can still scavenge ships to open up dock space for a replacement, but something I found a bit annoying is if you send a ship to Kenway's fleet when you have full dock space, it'll just disappear. You have to salvage one of your ships to make room for a new one prior to recruiting it. That's not how it worked in the original. You could send ships to Kenway's fleet even if your docks were full, and when you access the menu, it would ask you what you wanted to do with that ship, whether it be scavenging it for materials or scavenging another ship to replace it within your docks. I realize this is a very minor thing, but it did make me waste a couple good ships I tried to recruit at the beginning. There's also no more simulated ship battles. Not a huge loss, they were kinda passive and boring anyway. All you could do was watch and occasionally throw a fire barrel. I'm overall happy with the overhaul they brought to the minigame, and it's still an effective way to passively accumulate income and materials for the Jackdaw. You can even collect map pieces through it to combine for new treasure maps too. What many people will undoubtedly appreciate about Resynced, maybe the most out of any other changes it makes, are the ones to its mission design. If I could sum up the changes to the mission design, I'd say it's overall intended to be less frustrating. There's no more instant fail states, with a few exceptions. be that on tailing missions or specific stealth missions in the original where if you were detected, it was immediate desynchronization. There's more ways and unique opportunities to complete certain missions. Just to give one example, for the Dukas assassination, you can now go through the manor on Great Inagua to free and recruit some prisoners to help create a diversion by attacking Dukas's men near the beach, allowing you to easily slip by towards his ship. There are nice little additions and alternative ways to complete missions like that scattered throughout the game. The big change I'm sure everyone will notice the most though is with the tailing missions. I'd say the volume and repetitive nature of the tailing missions is the biggest general critique I see of Black Flag. If you ask someone to name one thing they don't like about that game, they'd probably say tailing. Maybe some might say the modern day, depending on whom you ask. Many tailing missions have been straight up removed from the game, where instead of having to tail a target to a location, you'll need to go investigate somewhere that has clues as to where that target may be, so you can just go straight to them afterwards. And most of what tailing missions do remain are dramatically reduced in length and accommodate alternative ways to get the necessary information required for you to progress in the event that you're detected. One method they use for this are notes. With some tailing targets, once you're detected, the objective changes from tailing to killing them, where you can then pick up a note on their body with the convenient information Edward needs. Another method just has you chase the target to the location they would have eventually ended up at by tailing them anyway. There's no longer any tailings that require you to simultaneously eavesdrop on a moving conversation. If you are eavesdropping in this game, which is pretty rare, it's entirely stationary and impossible to fail. The game literally takes control away from you. Now, as you may recall, some tailing and eavesdropping missions in the original game had important character-driven or expository dialogue, like for Torres or Woods Rogers and Hornigold. In those cases, the dialogue is either moved to be in the part of a mission where you are tailing and can just overhear it, or in this example I'll show here is inserted into its own new cutscene.
Our aim is to steer the entire course of civilization, is it not?
The body enslaved inspires the mind to revolt, but enslave a man's mind, and his body will follow naturally.
A fair point, Grandmaster. Our aim is to steer the entire course of civilization, is it not?
A body enslaved inspires the mind to revolt, but enslave a man's mind, and his body will follow on naturally, efficiently.
A fair point, Grandmaster.
I've been consistent with the opinion through the years that tailing in Assassin's Creed isn't inherently bad. On the conceptual level, it makes perfect sense why an assassin would tail targets to learn and be privy to crucial information. It's fundamental to how they operate. The problem is, and in the Kenway games specifically, they were always really slow, long, and boring. If they found ways to pick up the pace and make them more engaging, I think people would be more open to them. But the old Assassin's Creed games never made much of an effort in doing that. But the tweaks made to them in Resynced provide a good roadmap of how they could actually work should any future Assassin's Creed title decide to incorporate them. The ship tailing missions are also present, but you no longer have to worry about evading an array of ship detection cones. You just have to simply follow the one ship without getting too close to it that it sees you. Another significant change made to the mission design is that just about each of the main story assassination targets have a proper boss fight should you fail to assassinate them undetected. Some people may have mixed feelings about this because they do have large boss health bars and are more damage spongy than the traditional enemy, but I felt they made each target a little more substantial and climactic to defeat. You can't just insta-counter kill some of them like they're another NPC as you could in the original game. As much as doing that to Duncan was pure comedy. I almost didn't want to straight up assassinate some of these targets because I was curious what their boss fights were like. Additionally, the level design for a lot of the main story assassinations have been expanded too, usually with an extra area or room full of valuables where you can collect portraits of each target to hang up in Great Inagua. I actually think the worst part about the changes to the mission design is that there's no longer a way to replay missions. Mirage is the only recent Assassin's Creed game to give us that option, which they had to add post-launch, when it used to be a staple and near given with every Assassin's Creed game. It just always seemed like such an obvious, logical thing to include in these games, but I guess we might have taken it for granted because it's become a rare commodity these days. For the larger RPGs, I can understand why that would be harder to implement. They're far bigger, the missions aren't nearly as linear, and they don't have defined sequences like the older games. But for games like Mirage and Resynced, maybe Resynced especially since it was a feature in the original game, that's something that I think is needed. It's an easy, surefire way to bring more replay value to a game. people aren't going to be motivated to start entire new playthroughs to repeat that one section or mission they really wanted to give another go or complete in a different way. The changes to the mission and level design are among the best Resynced makes as a remake, but that is one of the biggest downsides of it all to me. But a feature this game has that the original didn't, a feature people always wanted, including myself as someone who always downloaded mods to do this, was a way to constantly keep Edward's hood on. Those pleas have finally been answered in Resynced with a real-time hood toggle. However, if you want to consistently keep your hood on, be prepared for battle, because the game will fight you on that. It automatically slides off every time you enter water, which is a cool, realistic detail, but I don't know if you noticed, there's a lot of water in Black Flag, and many of the main story cutscenes force the hood off as well. It almost feels like a constant game of tug of war trying to keep that hood on at all times. As much as I enjoy having a hood toggle, I do think some sort of setting to keep it always on when entering water or exiting cutscenes would be nice too. Especially since every original outfit has returned in Resynced and is looking better than ever. The cloth physics look nice and flowy on a lot of the outfits, especially the cloaks. There are a couple that are stuck to Edward's legs, but Altair's robes have finally been liberated. Duncan's outfit is now usable throughout the whole game. I know that's something a lot of people were hoping for. We have Connor's robes in a new Assassin's Creed game for the first time since Unity. As a Connor fanboy, that's much appreciated. And the metallic armors like Captain Drake's outfit or the Mayan armor look really reflective and shiny. They unfortunately didn't give the Mayan armor a hood like I was hoping. I think that's the one thing that would make it a 10 out of 10 for me. But it's still one of my favorite endgame outfits in the franchise. The outfits that previously had perks attached to them in the original, like the Mayan and Templar outfits, now have those perks in the form of trinkets instead. Which I actually prefer because now I can keep the perks of those outfits while wearing other stuff. Whenever I got the Mayan armor in the original, I never really wanted to take it off because having invulnerability to gunfire was such a strong advantage to have. And after spending all that time getting the Templar outfit, it kinda sucked that you couldn't keep the perks from it if you wanted to switch to something like the Mayan armor. There's some new outfits too, my favorite of the lot, unsurprisingly, being the MasterAssassin outfit. They finally gave Edward one. And no, it's not my favorite just because it's named after me. You know, I'm gonna keep making that joke until Ubisoft actually puts a MasterAssassin inspired outfit in one of these games. I really like the black and white color scheme and leatherish look to it though. It feels very unique to Edward and Black Flag. I wish the same could be said for the HUD and general UI. They did keep a lot of the original menu sound effects, which I love. They're so distinct that you can hear them out of context and immediately know what game it's from. They just fit the vibe and tone of Black Flag really well. The UI itself, though, is a little more generic and similar to Shadows than I would have liked. I understand that the version of the Animus we're using in-universe has a lot to do with the general HUD and UI design. This is the same dark Animus from Shadows, so it makes sense in-universe why it looks so similar, and it doesn't look bad by any means, but it's very plain looking to me. I really wish they leaned more into the unique Black Flag aesthetic, like the original, with the kinda blue-green, turquoise color palette. General stores, upgrading screens, memory corridors, the inventory screen. This even has an impact on the design of the White Room scenes, which, again, I'll talk more about when we get to the story, but it all just looks a bit bland to me. They really embraced the color for the in-game visuals. I wish they did the same for the UI. I don't need to tell you Black Flag Resynced is a good-looking game, I think that's pretty apparent, but beyond visual fidelity, there's a brightness and liveliness to Black Flag that has always really resonated with me, even in the original graphics. It has a very upbeat, rich, vibrant, and diverse color palette that Resynced fully embraces. The glistening blue waters, lush green vegetation, orange-soaked sunsets. It's just a pleasant game to look at. The vibes are always high. All that being said, while the game looks great, and I love that it really embraces the colors and saturation, it's missing some of the grit from the original art direction. It's very polished and clean looking, whereas the original game had a certain grittiness to its aesthetic from the environments that was specifically fitting for a city like Nassau that, as this free, lawless pirate society, was very dirty and run down, and provided a strong contrast to cities like Havana and Kingston, to the characters who had a more rough, weathered look to them. I'll talk more about the characters when we get into the story and cutscenes, but there was a certain intentional grimy look to Black Flag that Resynced, while undeniably stunning, doesn't fully recapture. But what I actually value even more than the graphics of Resynced is the implementation of the Atmos dynamic weather system, which was absolutely one of the best parts about AC Shadows to me. It's among the best dynamic weather I've seen in a video game. From the fluid wind simulation that systemically impacts the direction particles, tree branches, foliage, clothes, and hair sway, to how seamlessly and realistically it transitions to different weather states. You can see storm clouds forming and lightning in the distance as it approaches. Storms in particular look extremely atmospheric in this game. Once a storm passes, you can see reflective rain puddles scattered around the ground. The weather system makes the world feel very frenetic. Everything is constantly in motion. The general destructibility of the environments attribute to that too, like pots or bottles falling and breaking during parkour, or rooftop tiles beneath your feet, smashing wooden crates and the like during combat. The environments are malleable and reactive, the way all these different little objects dynamically respond to your actions. Ubisoft in the Assassin's Creed franchise may be regressing in some areas, but from a visual and technological standpoint, that's a consistent thing that has only improved over time, and I can only imagine how much further they'll be able to push some of these systems in the future. Sailing the open blue seas is just a good time in Black Flag. It's one of those AC games where I rarely feel incentivized to fast travel because sailing is such an enjoyable, relaxing, and oftentimes rewarding experience when you want it to be, with plenty of activities on the high seas to get up to. The sea shanties are back in full force, with new ones being added to the roster, including some Blackbeard and Steed Bonnet themed ones. Being able to manually select them is a very nice quality of life addition. They've been stuck in my head again throughout the whole process of playing the game and making this video. You can have pets in the form of a cat or monkey aboard the Jackdaw to accompany you now too. They don't have any gameplay effects, they're pretty much strictly cosmetic, but you can pet them in the captain's quarters. Actually, while we're on the subject, you can feed or pet almost every animal in this game, and if you can't, then it's because you're supposed to hunt them. A feature I always personally hoped for was a way to let someone else steer the Jackdaw so you could roam around the deck as it sailed in real time. I always wanted to be able to go below deck too. Unfortunately, neither of those things are a possibility in Resynced, though there is an auto-follow feature like for the horses in the previous games, so if you want to just chill and take in the sights, listening to sea shanties while the Jackdaw takes you to your location, you can do that. Well, unless there's storms which force you out of travel sails, and because there's no longer a minimap, you have to be more spatially aware of where rogue waves and water spouts are, otherwise they can kinda sneak up on you. Although, I'm not sure if I'm imagining things here, the storm frequency feels really high in this game, like a lot higher than the original. And it's a little annoying sometimes, because if you're caught in one and want to do some of the activities like the underwater dives or harpooning, you just have to sit there for sometimes minutes on end for the storm to pass. Resynced retains the world size and layout of the original map, while adding new islands to explore, fleshing out pre-existing ones, and all while being completely seamless in the process. No more loading screens getting into any of the major cities or Great Inagua, which feels very natural. One of the bigger weaknesses of the original open world was that many of its smaller islands were oftentimes very bland and barren, most of which only offered a collectible animus fragment, chest, or sometimes both, making the game feel like a bit of a collectathon at times. The smaller islands are a bit more substantial and varied in Resynced, either with loot, unique world moments, or environmental storytelling, and some are actually populated by NPCs who can be drinking, singing, and dancing, bringing some more life to some of these locations. Explorable islands have flocks of birds swirling above them now, a smart bit of game design to diegetically indicate to you that these are areas you can get off your ship and explore from a distance. It reminds me of what Sucker Punch does a lot in their open worlds by using visual in-world cues to signal where content is located to the player. And there's more of these unique world moments scattered around pre-existing locations and cities too. For example, there's an old man Edward can speak to in Nassau about the true meaning of freedom, which directly reflects where his character is at the beginning of the story. Or there's little comedic moments like where this drunk guy has somehow made it to the edge of this cliff, whilst claiming he ended up there after having 5 drinks from the tavern. Well, if you go to the tavern and actually have 5 drinks in a row, you'll wake up in the exact same spot with a chest to loot. And I love that there's no mission objective telling you to do that, it's just something you have to put together on your own, and the game rewards you for it. There's also quite a significant amount of new ambient dialogue throughout the world. Whether it's providing more context and background to some of the events of the main story, like the pirate who's hanged in Havana at the beginning, or NPCs having normal, everyday conversations, like these two guys just fishing and talking about how they miss their pirating days. There's a lot of minute additions littered throughout the world like that add up, fleshing out the world building a little more, and creating a larger sense of liveliness to the Caribbean. Great Inagua has seen a pretty significant expansion too. Not only is it a bit more busy and lively with NPCs going about their day and thanking you for liberating them, but there are new structures to build, like the treasure dealer, where you can put together map pieces for new special treasure maps and craft outfits. There's more perks associated with renovations. You can now make a passive income through protection money. It caps at 5,000 reals, which is kind of small, but if you're doing a lot of side activities, by the mid to late game, you're gonna have more than enough coin than you can probably spend anyway. The manor itself is far more customizable. You can do lots of interior decorating with ship models, paintings, weapon, and armor displays. You can even collect portraits of a lot of the main story assassination targets and some of Edward's friends. It's a bit of a weird hobby Edward picked up, I guess. Me personally, I wouldn't have a portrait of Julian Ducasse framed above my bed, but that's just me. Edward doesn't really strike me as the type of guy to make such profound statements about paintings either, at least not at this point in his life.
The sun sliding below the sea is a sight matched only by when it rises again.
Edward, please, just shut up every now and again, okay? Bernard Woodhouse is the former butler of the estate, a completely new character who tasks you with restoring Verano House to its former glory. None of the new cutscenes with him are mo-capped, but I do think he's a pretty interesting, mysterious guy that adds some lore and background to Great Inagua. I enjoyed some of his interactions and dynamic with Edward. All the original side content has returned, from some of the smaller things like bottled letters, Mayan stelas, buried treasure, burning ships, and collectible sea shanties, to the more substantial story-driven Templar hunts, or forts and plantations to clear, with several hours worth of new narrative side quest arcs for Blackbeard, Steed Bonnet, the new officers, and an entire storyline revolving around Robert Maynard for good measure. The assassination and naval contracts have a little more story and context attached to them. Edward typically has a new line or two, making an observation or comment about them when first accepting them or after finishing them. The assassination targets and some of their minions have additional dialogue too. It's not a whole lot, but it does make them feel a smidge more distinct and varied from one another. Assassination contracts by nature are kind of repetitive, but I like that they just fulfill the basic assassin fantasy of taking down specified targets. The optional bonus objectives for more reals are still there too, which encourage you to kill targets in more creative and challenging ways than you normally probably would. The additions to the naval contracts are a bit more substantial because now Milo Vondergraaf, a mysterious contractor whom we never met in the original game, is a fully realized character here, who personally gives Edward some contracts every now and again. The contracts themselves are still pretty much exactly the same gameplay and design-wise, but once again, there's a little more of an attempt to add some overarching story to them and alleviate the repetition. Taverns function exactly the same. Edward looks at somebody the wrong way, or someone randomly tries to pick a fight with him. You beat everybody up with the unarmed combat, which is one of the only instances in the game where you can actually use it, and afterwards you can buy tips from the bartender on the location of naval convoys and play some mini-games. I love that the bartenders still just whisper absolute gibberish in Edward's ear.
A little bird told me that something going on.
I realize this is very nitpicky, but I think it's a little lame they didn't actually animate the hands moving the game pieces in the tavern minigames like the original. Plantations, in a similar fashion to the contracts, have little side stories attached to them that directly affect where the warehouse key you need to loot is located, whether it's been fed to a crocodile or a monkey stole it. There was none of that before. You simply had to use Eagle Vision to discover which exact guard had the key on their person. So once again, these changes help make each plantation feel a little more unique. I also like that you can now explore the interiors of the manors on the plantations, and there's more NPCs scattered about, again livening up the environments a little bit. The forts are probably one of the more enjoyable side activities from Black Flag for me. It's kind of an encapsulation of everything fun about Black Flag and the pirate fantasy, combining naval to ground combat pretty seamlessly. Once again, there's a couple new lines of dialogue whenever you near a fort from your crew on the Jackdaw. talking about the horror stories or myths they heard about that particular fort. After destroying a few towers, the remaining forces will now intensify and start attacking more frequently with increased damage, making them more difficult the closer you get to destroying them. If you have naval difficulty set to hard, this can make some of them very challenging. There were a few instances where I just had to cut my losses and come back once I had more upgrades for my jackdaw. Once the defenses are broken and you dock to raid the fort, it works similarly to boarding, where the fort has an overall morale meter you need to deplete through dropping bodies. Whereas before, also like boarding, you had specified objectives and targets you needed to complete to be successful. Again, I prefer this. It gives you more freedom and combat opportunities, and fort captains will actually fight back as the last line of defense, instead of just surrendering and letting you execute them. Oh, and you can actually see and follow your crew as they exit the jackdaw to attack the fort, rather than them just magically teleporting there by the time you arrive. I imagine they used some of the tech from Valhalla's raids for this stuff, especially since opening the stronghold requires you to break it open with a member of your crew like the raids in that game, which I'm not crazy about because sometimes you have to wait a little while for them to catch up and do it. I don't know why they don't just let us open it ourselves like the original. And I said this in my previous video, it's lame that they don't let you kill the surrendering enemies anymore. Hey, there were comments in that video saying they would do the same thing, so it's good to know I'm not the only one who enjoys partaking in the occasional war crime. When you complete the forts, there's new ambient dialogue bits as you're leaving of people either thanking you for liberating them or members of your crew just messing about.
Christ, what I'd give for a smoke. Got a pipe on you by chance, huh?
Are you mad? You'll blow us all to hell.
When you acquire a diving bell, opportunities to go on underwater dives and shipwrecks will appear throughout the seas. These were probably some of my least favorite side activities in the original. I liked the idea of them, they made sense to have in a pirate game, but I always found them fairly tedious. Some of the changes they made to underwater gameplay in Resynced help with that. You can now blend with fish to hide from sharks, and when sharks do detect you, rather than a QTE minigame, you simply have to time a dodge to avoid them. While again, I don't really miss the QTE stuff, this does make sharks feel like less of a threat. I didn't really care much to hide with fish or in the overgrowth much because they're so trivial to avoid now, even when they do see you. Though that change and the removal of those annoying ass eels from the original make the underwater sections generally less frustrating and tedious. I hated those eels. Their removal alone makes these sections better, and they're still worth doing too, since many of them have max upgrade schematics for the jackdaw. Harpooning is almost exactly the same. The biggest difference is that with there now being an activity-specific difficulty, you have the option to make it significantly harder, which I honestly didn't enjoy very much. On hard, you only get a few hits before they snap the rope, and some of the tougher sea creatures like great white sharks and humpback whales have very quick and strong attacks, where the only way you can interrupt them on hard is to land a perfect shot. It's doable, but it's a very tight window, and these things can 2 or 3 shot you, even with maximum robo armor. It made harpooning more monotonous than I cared for it to be. The legendary ships are quite the challenge on hard mode too, but even those felt more doable than some of these harpoons. I always really enjoyed the legendary ships. They're essentially naval boss fights and really put your jackdaw and skill with the naval mechanics to the test. They could already be quite difficult in the original game, and that's doubly true on hard mode in Resynced. You really need to rely on some of those new abilities like Perfect Brace and Ram Dash. The Templar hunts are far more narrative-driven than any of the other side content in the original game. They kind of felt like an extension of the main story, seeing Edward trying to make amends for selling out the assassins to the Templars, while there being an ulterior motive and something in it for his own selfish reasons too, as there always is with Edward. It's fun seeing him clash with some of these eccentric assassin personalities, and many of the scenes are actually performance captured despite being side content. Resynced added some new dialogue to each of them, including a little button-end conversation after their final missions, giving a little more closure to their storylines. Like the main story, the mission design for them is reworked as well. These two relied quite heavily on tailing missions and are scaled back or reduced using similar methods seen in the main story. Before I get into some of the new side content and story changes and additions, I'm gonna have to issue a spoiler warning. I initially intended to do this review completely spoiler-free, but there's so many specific things I want to talk about that it would be really difficult or impossible to do so while trying to avoid and dance around spoilers. So I figured it was better to just unshackle myself from that limitation and talk about the things I want to talk about. If you don't know the story of Black Flag or haven't finished Resynced yet, and don't want any of the new stuff spoiled, go ahead and click off the video. I hope you consider coming back once you finish the game, but if not, thank you for joining me to this point. And for those of you that are still here with me, let's get right to it. The new Blackbeard and Steed Bonnet specific side quests were by far the ones I was most looking forward to, and fittingly by far, in my opinion, are the best of the new content Resynced has to offer. I was already very satisfied with Blackbeard's role in the original game. I don't know if he truly needed more in the same way as a character like Steed, but I thought his treasure hunt-centric quest was a pretty nice, meaningful addition, solidifying his legacy as someone wanting to build a free society. I actually think my favorite part about this quest is the implication that the flowers Edward eventually gives to Jenny at the end of the game are grown from the tools Thatch leaves for Edward. That's a really sweet little tie-in. Though I don't think that quest was needed nearly as much as Steed's. Steed's was my favorite of the new side quests. I might be a little biased here because I recently made an entire video about Steed Bonnet where I did a lot of research into the historical figure, who just has a very fascinating story, but Steed is one of those characters in the original game that was kind of left behind by the plot, as he departed around halfway through the story, and his death happened completely off-screen, which you only ever heard about in passing through missable ambient dialogue. This new quest for him in Resynced provides a far more satisfying conclusion and closure for his character. We didn't get to see his death, but it did hit a lot of the emotional beats I was hoping it would. I really like how they revealed his fate, with his voice reading out that final letter to Edward, Edward seeing his apparition on his ship, and with that great new song, our boy finally got his sugar back. While I still think it was pretty clear that Edward came to eventually view Steed as a genuine friend in the main story, actually getting to see him react to his death and mourn him was very fulfilling to see. Because again, there's never even a brief moment of him reacting or acknowledging Steed's death in the original, until you see him as one of the ghostly apparitions during the parting glass. And like I figured he would, Edward felt guilty about Steed's death, because he's the one who encouraged him to sail for Nassau to begin with. He thinks he led him astray.
Life can't be all pleasure and distraction, you told me. I fear I led you astray, my friend.
But also, like I figured, Steed didn't blame him. In his view, Edward gave him the courage to live the life he wanted free. And I really like that final interaction with the portrait and Steed's dagger. It all felt like a fitting tribute and send-off to the gentleman pirate.
An exquisite piece, Captain Kenway. I could find buyers for it, should you wish to sell.
Some things hold more value than gold, silver, or rum.
It's not a very long quest, especially in comparison to the other new stuff, but it was honestly my favorite of all the new story content they added. Brief, but impactful nonetheless. I thought the officer questlines were alright. I like Deadman Smith, he's definitely my favorite of the three. First of all, Deadman as a nickname goes unbelievably hard, and when you learn why he gets that nickname, it's certainly earned. He just has like the most morbid, pessimistic response to everything. Some of his lines genuinely made me laugh. But it makes a lot of sense why he's that way. His backstory is very dark and tragic. On the whole though, I found it difficult to truly invest and resonate with these characters like I feel like the game wanted me to, especially since they play such a large role in the new A World Without Gold questline. When Maynard tosses that key, I feel like the game wanted me to react how Edward does with this big, dramatic "No!" My reaction was a little more like, oh no. None of the cutscenes in the individual officer questlines are mocapped, which I really think could have gone a long way in making them feel more alive and real, letting us really connect with them. I know they're side quests, but I mean, the Templar hunts from the original game are side quests and they're performance captured, and that was in addition to doing performance capture for hours worth of a main story. So is it really too much to ask for some more of these scenes to be mocapped and resynced? To be fair, I do think some of the procedurally generated scenes look a bit better than the recent games. They're more dynamic and creative with character movements and camera angles, but it's still a very noticeable step down in presentational quality from the main story and even the Templar hunts. There are some new mocapped scenes for the A World Without Gold questline focusing on Robert Maynard. There's a couple at the beginning and end. The main story now sets up Maynard. Blackbeard has a few new lines mentioning how he's been hounding him across the sea, and they inserted him into Blackbeard's death scene as the guy who landed the final fatal blow, so by the time he shows up in this quest, we and Edward already know who he is. To be honest though, I didn't love how he was characterized here. He felt a bit over the top and cartoonish, very one-dimensional. It doesn't really match the tone of the rest of the game, where you have so many fleshed out, morally ambiguous antagonists, with more grounded historical portrayals like Laureano Torres or Ben Hornigold. I'm by no means an expert on Robert Maynard, but his portrayal here doesn't feel very grounded.
Let it not be said that those with power cannot treat the little people charitably.
Where they inserted this questline relative to the main story doesn't make a whole lot of sense either. You unlock it after sequence 11, which is right after the climax of the main story. Edward finally has his epiphany, his moment of realization, and decides to let go of his greed and dedicate himself to cleaning up his mess and helping the assassins. This questline has to take place after that because Anne is his quartermaster during it, so why is Edward's character growth just completely undone in this quest? He's right back to being motivated by gold and greed. Do you know how jarring it is to go straight from this?
For years I've been rushing around taking whatever I fancied, not giving a tinker's curse for those I hurt. And yet here I am, with riches and a reputation, feeling no wiser than when I left home.
To this?
You want to figure out a way to get your hands on his gold.
And why not? We can deal with the bastard, rob him blind, and make ourselves rich at the same time.
His motivations during this don't track. Why is he reverted back to being like Edward from earlier in the story? I found that very frustrating. He kinda has to learn the same lesson all over again and eventually choose the power of friendship over gold. Don't get me wrong, it's nice to have new stuff to do in the game. I like seeing more of Anne as quartermaster since that was very short-lived in the original. And I really like the final scene with the Phantom Thatch. It's a sweet little button end to the first scene they did with him during the treasure hunt, and it being fully mocap certainly helps. But between this and the officer questlines, I wasn't too enthralled with these new characters and storylines. They're a very noticeable step down in writing and presentational quality from the main story. It's obvious it wasn't written by Darby McDevitt, that's for sure. And I guess I'll talk about the modern day here too, since it's technically side content. It's pretty wild and sad to think that modern day in Assassin's Creed is optional side content now, but thus are the times we live in, I suppose. I didn't have very high expectations for the Animus Rifts, but from a gameplay and level design perspective, I thought they were actually really fun. Dare I say, some of the most fun, playable modern day sections since AC3? Well, okay, I guess that's not really saying much since many of the modern days since AC3 haven't had much in the way of gameplay, but still, I was really impressed with how creative some of the level design and visuals were. Some of the stuff that was happening on my screen was just like pure mind-melting madness, and I loved it. These rifts have puzzles, platforming, numerous unique combat and stealth sections. That last rift in particular, I had chills through most of it. It definitely turned up the fan service, seeing all the different locations from the Assassin's Creed games with Ezio's family swelling, but I really enjoyed it nonetheless. In terms of the actual overarching modern day narrative, it's still kind of hard to get truly invested in it when so much of the story is told through optional data files and audio logs, and there not being a defined voiced protagonist we can really latch onto. This whole meta idea that we as the players are the modern day protagonist accessing the Animus sounds cool and a lot better in theory than it is in actual practice, in my opinion. Because there's no real main character to ground anything in, to get behind. We need a Desmond. Speaking of which, we still don't know when or if we'll ever hear or see about what the Reader, Layla, and Basim were up to after Valhalla. It's now been 6 years since we were left on that cliffhanger. Maybe they'll try to incorporate that into this storyline at some point. I gave up trying to guess where they're gonna go with the modern day a long time ago now. The rifts were really fun and there were some really hype moments, but as for the actual story, it's interesting, but still not really what I hope for out of Assassin's Creed. I wouldn't even be surprised if a lot of players don't know or care what's happening with it because of it being optional and how the majority of it is presented. But it's looking like we're locked into this format and storyline for a while, so we'll see where it goes, I guess. Anyways, let's finally get into the main story. Turns out my concerns about the weather and time of day during cutscenes were mostly unfounded. The game retains the scripted, intentional weather and time of day during the original cutscenes. In some cases, it'll actually have you wait and time-lapse into the correct time of day before the cutscene starts. They did intentionally change it during some scenes as well, like when boarding that Man-O-War on Blackbeard's ship, which I actually think looks a bit more fitting and cinematic in a storm. Some of the locations of the cutscenes have been changed too to better fit the mission design, now that some of these are no longer preceded or followed up by tailing missions. With the character models though, it's a bit of a mixed bag for me. They all have a more clean and polished look to them overall, which looks good on some, like Caroline, Steed, Anne, Torres, even Roberts looks quite good. But for some of the pirates, Edward included, that kind of rough around the edges, disheveled, and gritty quality to their appearances is diminished, which felt very fitting for their characters in the original. They're pirates, they're kind of filthy, their skin is really damaged and tan from being out in the sun so much. Edward's model objectively looks better, he's clearly modeled after that design in the original cinematic trailer, but that general roughness to his exterior is kinda buffed out. His skin is smoother and paler. This felt very noticeable to me in the scenes where he pretends to be Duncan and meets with the Templars, because in the original game, he looks so out of place next to some of these more sophisticated, well-groomed, and put-together Templars. As you walk to Torres' mansion, the guards make a comment about how rough Edward looks, and Rogers is even a little suspicious of him because he doesn't look at all like the handsome man he heard Duncan describe to him as. Not that Edward's ugly, but he looks more like how you would expect a man who's been living on the seas in poor conditions for years. It's a similar deal with characters like James Kidd, whose skin is also far more polished and pale looking. I think the most egregious example has to be with Charles Vane. He doesn't look nearly as menacing and crazy. The other part of this is the facial animations, which are a bit more stiff on the new models. When looking at the cutscenes side by side, it's very clear to see the original faces were more nuanced and expressive in their animations. While I was playing the game and seeing some of these cutscenes, something felt slightly off-putting that I couldn't quite put my finger on. I thought maybe it was just because I was so used to how the characters looked in the original game, and maybe that's part of it, but I think the difference in facial animation played a big part in that too. The best part about the new models to me is the hair. You can see like each individual strand now, and the way it flows during cutscenes and gameplay looks very realistic. Thatch's beard is looking majestic, cuts and bruises look better. There's definitely some pros and cons with the character models, but I couldn't really shake that slightly off-putting feeling I had looking at some of them throughout the game. And as I briefly alluded to earlier, I'm not a fan of the new all-black design for the memory corridors. I get how some may think it's more fitting for these confessional death scenes, being so dark and moody, but I felt that the turquoise particle background captured the atmosphere and personality of Black Flag. I will say though, I like that the final confrontation with Vane isn't in a memory corridor anymore. It never really made sense for it to be in one because Edward didn't kill Vane here, and that's typically when they're used. As for some of the new dialogue and scenes inserted into the main story, there's genuinely a lot more than I was expecting. Almost every mission has some form of new dialogue. Some I felt were nice, meaningful additions, others felt a little more unnecessary and jarring. Jean Guédon, the original creative director of the original game, in that initial showcase, said he couldn't tell while playing Resynced where the old content ended and new stuff began, that it was very seamless. And I realize that's probably just marketing speak on his end, but I'm gonna have to respectfully disagree with him for the most part on that one. I think it's fairly apparent what's new versus what's old, at least in most situations. You can see and feel the seams. Now, I don't think someone who's never played the original Black Flag would be able to tell, although maybe some can. But for those who know the original game very well, some of these voice actors with their new lines don't sound the same as they did 13 years ago, so in certain situations it feels very jarring and obvious when new dialogue or a cutscene is inserted in between the original stuff. A select few characters I could actually barely tell. Steed, Thatch, and Bonnie, they all sound relatively the same, maybe a little different in some scenes. Adewale sounds almost exactly the same, his voice has not aged a day. I genuinely wouldn't have been able to tell some of his new lines were new if it weren't for Edward responding back to him. With others like James Kidd or Edward though, you can definitely hear the difference. I love Matt Ryan, he's a legend, I love how enthusiastic and passionate he is about this game and franchise. His excitement during interviews is contagious. But his voice has aged a little bit. You know, back then he was in like his early 30s, voicing a guy who himself was in his early to mid 20s. I mean, Edward's actually supposed to be like 17, 18 during those Caroline flashbacks, while now he's in his 40s and Edward is still obviously the same age. And this is probably in the direction they gave him, but some of these lines are delivered in a sort of artificially enthusiastic tone. The delivery doesn't sound quite as low-key and natural as the original lines.
If you say he's got the stuff, then I would like to find this Padre.
Edward also talks to himself a lot now. This is a trend I've seen in many AAA games recently that's a bit of a pet peeve of mine, where the main characters talk to themselves a lot as either a way to guide the player by pointing out obvious things, or just commenting and making quips about absolutely everything that happens. Some of these new lines are not necessary.
That was too bloody close.
Like, do we really need that? Or there was another example that stood out to me when chasing Vane.
God tame that stubborn mule. The lunatic has lost all sense!
Or when Edward catches on to the spy at Blackbeard's retirement party.
That's what pirating gets you.
He's a spy.
Nah, really, Edward, you don't say. Sometimes it felt like these new lines were added just for the sake of adding them, or because they're worried the modern audience is dumb and have to point out every little thing to make sure they understand what's happening, and in some cases I feel it only distracts from or dilutes the experience. They recast Lawrence Prinz, I assume because they wanted to add new dialogue for him, and the actor who portrayed him in the original, Christian Rodska, unfortunately passed away a couple years ago. But at that point, I wish they'd just foregone the idea of giving that character new dialogue, because the new voice is a significant step down in my opinion. They had the new voice actor dub over the original performance capture, and all the character and personality of this twisted old man is just sapped out. The delivery is so flat compared to Rodska's.
Why hang over me like a leering crow to see an old man suffer?
You've caused no small portion of suffering yourself, Mr. Prince. Retribution, I suppose.
You absurd cutthroats and your precious philosophy. You live in the world, but you cannot make it move.
You mistake my motive, old man. I'm only after a bit of coin.
As was I, lad. As was I.
Why hang over me like a leering crow to see an old man suffer?
You've caused no small portion of suffering yourself, Mr. Prince. Retribution, I suppose.
You absurd cutthroats and your precious philosophy. You live in the world, but you cannot make it move.
You mistake my motive, old man. I'm only after a bit of coin.
As was I, lad. As was I.
And while the eagle in the Jackdaw nightmare sequence doesn't have any new dialogue, they added this weird distortion and slow-mo effect to some of the original lines. I get what they're attempting to do, it's a very trippy, creepy sequence, but the performances in that section are so strong. Don't mess with them with this weird distortion effect. Let them play out normally.
You haven't the metal for my brand of madness. You haven't the metal for my brand of madness.
Here's to gentlemen of fortune and women of leisure. Here's to gentlemen of fortune and women of leisure.
For I have dipped my hands in muddied waters, and, withdrawing them, find 'tis better to be a commander than a common man! For I have dipped my hands in muddied waters, and, withdrawing them, find 'tis better to be a commander than a common man!
There's quite a bit of new cutscenes inserted into the main story too, the biggest benefactor of which is probably Anne Bonny. She's introduced far earlier in the game. She's the first person you speak to at the Old Avery in Nassau. They actually separately mocapped her actress and inserted her into some original scenes that she was not previously in. It's almost like she's a phantom, but she slots in pretty seamlessly. In the original game, Anne Bonny isn't introduced until Sequence 6. Here, her presence is made felt far earlier and more consistently throughout, making that moment of her becoming the Jackdaw's quartermaster feel more earned. Although, they kind of unintentionally created a slight continuity issue. Anne, rather than staying in Nassau when Edward and some of the other pirates flee, now comes with Edward to Great Inagua. But then you have that projection at the observatory later where she's back at Nassau when she decides to go pirating with Mary Read and Jack Rackham. So she supposedly now fled Nassau to Great Inagua, saying there was nothing left for her there, then for some reason went back to work at the Old Avery in Nassau before becoming a pirate? Doesn't really make sense, but I guess it's not a big deal in the grand scheme of things. I really enjoyed the new scenes written by Darby McDevitt, the original game's writer. I already broke down the new hot chocolate scene with Caroline in a previous video. It gives you a little more insight into their dynamic and Edward's motivations. You get to see Edward be a little more caring and tender towards Caroline before the following scenes where he's drunk and yelling at her. And it creates a nice little full circle moment with Hatham at the end when he offers to treat him to chocolate afterwards. The scene slots in pretty naturally, and unlike some of the others, it's fully mocapped, so it doesn't feel jarring or out of place. I also liked getting to hear the contents of Edward's letter to Caroline. It makes her fate even more heartbreaking hearing how excited Edward was to see her again. And they slightly tweaked how he finds out she died too. I remember in Darby's dev commentary on the game, he said he wished they handled that moment a little better, so I imagine that change was his idea as well. Instead of just being handed the letter from Atabai and having this shocked expression, he goes back to his quarters to read it, and from his reaction and body language dropping his head, it's far more apparent that it's tragic news he's receiving. Although, again, with Adewale's new lines here, it feels natural, but as soon as Edward says, "My thanks, Ade," you can immediately hear how different he sounds from just a few lines ago.
I will, but only after I fix what I mangled back home.
You remind me. A letter came for you. It's from England.
My thanks, Ade.
One of my favorite new little additions is right after James Kidd has revealed herself as Mary Read and you've assassinated Lawrence Prince, you can go back up to the top of the windmill where Mary and Edward have a very candid, deep conversation. Edward tells her about Caroline and why he's doing all of this. It's a nice moment. I love stuff like this. It's a meaningful addition that fleshes out the relationship and dynamic between these two a little more. I also really like the new scene where they're all toasting in remembrance of Thatch just after his death. They've even got Ezio's family playing during it. But why on earth is this scene not mocapped? It's an important and impactful one right after one of the biggest moments of the game. That's really the problem with a lot of these new scenes. They're still using a lot of that procedural generation, and while many of the new scenes are very brief, it's still so jarring to go from a performance captured scene from the original into a new procedurally generated one. The difference in quality is night and day. It gave me a feeling of whiplash. Again, the original game had hours worth of mocapped scenes. Is it really too much to ask for some more of the new scenes that Resynced adds to be mocapped too? I'm so tired of this stupid hands-on-hips motion Edward does. I've been seeing it since Odyssey. I get why they had to rely on it for some of the RPGs where there's tons of cutscenes and branching dialogue options, but for a more linear and condensed experience like Black Flag, the extent of its use is way too much for my liking. It only dilutes the overall presentation. There were also some things I was hoping or expecting to see added in Resynced's story that were excluded. Black Flag doesn't have a ton of cut content, at least compared to most games in the series, but one of the biggest cuts made in the conception phase of the original game was a late game sequence surrounding a historical event with Anne Bonny and Mary Read. If you listen to almost any Black Flag related interview with Darby McDevitt, he brings it up very frequently. You can tell he really wanted it to be in the game. It's one of the most famous historical events from the golden age of piracy. What was supposed to happen is once Roberts betrays Edward, instead of Roberts turning him in for a bounty, Edward escapes and goes back to Nassau to enlist the aid of Mary in tracking him back down. Mary, being an assassin, wants to find the observatory too, of course, and prevent it from ending up in Templar hands. So there would be a few missions of Edward, Mary, Anne, and Jack Rackham looking for Roberts, before eventually they're all captured and sent to that Jamaican prison together. Mary Read and Anne Bonny were like the only ones holding and fighting off the British, while Jack and the rest of his crew were passed out and drunk below deck. They reference it in a later scene, but we were actually supposed to see that. Edward was supposed to be there and get captured with them, instead of him conveniently ending up in the same Jamaican prison as them afterwards. This would have accomplished a few things. For one, we would have seen more of Anne Bonny first becoming a pirate. To be fair, Resynced does do a better job of showing her trajectory towards becoming Edward's quartermaster, and we still see a small snippet of Mary recruiting her, but it would have been nice to actually see her make that transformation from barmaid to pirate firsthand. You would have had more interactions with Edward and Mary before her death, and Darby said he was really going to turn up Edward's selfish desperation to get his hands on the crystal skull from the observatory, and Mary would really start to get fed up with him, which I think would not only have made her death even more impactful than it already is, but further hammer home Edward's guilt over her death and his eventual decision to let go of his greed and help the assassins in her memory. And then, as a plus, we'd get more of Calico Jack. Jack Rackham is the most underutilized of all the historical pirates in this game. He's kinda there for occasional brief comedic relief, and his one big moment is pulling a mutiny on Charles Vane, which is very short-lived. He's captured and defeated by Mary and Adewale off-screen. That's another thing I always wished we could see. After escaping that island, I wanted to be able to track down Rackham and reclaim the Jackdaw. Correct me if I'm wrong here, but I don't think Rackham has anything new in Resynced. Not even so much as a new line of dialogue, which of all the characters in this cast who needed to be fleshed out a bit more, I think he's right near the top of that list. When we first started hearing whispers of this remake, this was a cut sequence I always assumed would be restored. I would have much preferred to see that over the Robert Maynard questline, for example. Though maybe it's for the best, because I don't know if I have enough faith in Ubisoft to insert something so substantial into the main story that would be of the same quality as the rest of Black Flag's main story. Like, if it had a bunch of procedurally generated cutscenes or wasn't even written by Darby, then maybe it's for the best they didn't add it, but still, kind of disappointing. Same deal with the cut El Tiburon boss fight. That cut happened much later in the original game's development. When Edward is caught by the Templars in Torres' manor trying to get his hands on the sage, instead of just being easily sucker punched and captured by El Tiburon, there was going to be an actual boss fight where the player was scripted to lose. This fight actually still happens in the novelization, funnily enough, and would create this full circle moment when we fight El Tiburon at the end of the game. That cut was made so late into the game's development that they still have dialogue during that final boss fight of Edward acknowledging and referencing their first cut fight, which is still in Resynced.
This again, eh?
It also makes Edward saying this make a lot more sense.
You humbled me once, and I took that hard lesson and I bettered myself. Die, knowing that for all of our conflict, you helped make a soldier out of a scoundrel.
It kinda still works if you just imagine the earlier fight Edward refers to as him simply getting sucker punched. El Tiburon is a really cool name with a cool character design, but he too I think is very underutilized. And I'm surprised they didn't see fit to restore that early boss fight, especially since it wouldn't have been as substantial as the Mary and Anne cut sequence. I enjoyed some of the things they added, don't get me wrong, but I think some of those resources would have been better spent on some of these cut ideas and content from the original game. I have a very complicated web of thoughts and emotions when it comes to Resynced. It took quite a while to untangle it all, clearly. I was just going through the things I felt passionate about, and before I knew it, this ended up becoming a behemoth of a video. I kinda started to realize that when, by the time I was done talking about the gameplay changes, it was already longer than the entirety of my Shadows review. But if you made it all the way to the end here, I really appreciate it. At the end of the day, I know I had fun playing Resynced. Black Flag is just a fun formula for a Pirates and Assassin's Creed game, but is it weird that while I was playing it, I had a strong urge to replay the original? Which I just replayed not long ago, by the way. There were some elements of the original game I really found myself yearning for during my playthrough. The game feel and controls, the massive catalog of varied, fluid animations. I think Resynced is partly held back by some of the same issues as the other recent AC games, but at the same time, it does address a lot of people's biggest issues with the original game. The mission design, the modern day, there are some new meaningful and impactful story additions, many of the more barren areas of the world were fleshed out, and some of the side activities were given more distinction. I don't know if I've ever played a remake quite like this. I've seen some people call it ambitious, others call it safe. I don't necessarily believe it's either of those things, or maybe it's both of them. It's not a complete, built-from-the-ground reimagining like the recent Final Fantasy VII or Resident Evil remakes, but it's not the exact same game with a graphical overhaul and slight gameplay changes like some others either. It's somewhere in the middle, where it's in large part the same story and overall formula, but with completely different gameplay foundations, hours worth of new content, and lots of little tweaks, removals, and additions on the foundation of the original story. Labeling it as safe or ambitious feels reductive. Black Flag, for all intents and purposes, is probably the most popular game in the series. It's an AC game that has a very large fan base outside of the Assassin's Creed community. I know people for whom Black Flag is their only experience with this franchise because they heard pirate, open-world single-player game and signed up. The fantasy is that appealing to a lot of people. To be perfectly honest, Black Flag has never been my personal favorite Assassin's Creed game, like I know it is for many. It's always been in the upper echelon of the franchise for me, but there are a couple others I hold in a little higher esteem. Those too may be getting remakes soon, and I'm very curious if this is indicative of the approach they'll be taking with those as well. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed the review. Sorry for it being so long, but I figure you guys come to me for something a little more thorough and in-depth as such an Assassin's Creed focused channel. There are plenty of great channels out there who I'm sure have made more condensed, succinct reviews on the game. I haven't actually seen much of the general reception of it yet. I've been so tunnel visioned on my own review, and I like to form my own opinions in a vacuum before seeing what everyone else thinks. So let me know what you guys think of Resynced in the comments. Thank you once again for the support through the release of another AC game, and have a great rest of your day, Assassins.